Queen Mary I is England's first true Queen Regnant, and yet her reign is invariably considered a mere blip in the wider Tudor story, a short-lived window in which an intolerant zealot went around burning people alive with undiluted pleasure. The truth is, of course, far more complex. Many misconceptions surround Queen Mary I, and the infamous burnings are just the tip of the iceberg. Today, to unpack many of the things which are repeatedly misunderstood or misrepresented about Mary, I am pleased to welcome back Dr Peter Stiffell onto the podcast for a discussion all about his favourite subject, England's first crowned queen. From his annoyance at the term Mary Tudor, to Mary's own commitment to the good treatment of her household, to one of the most controversial topics, Mary's pregnancies. In this episode, we will uproot much of what people think they know of Mary's reign, and so prepare to, hopefully, have some of your opinions altered. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 122, The Misconceptions of Queen Mary I, with Dr Peter Stiffell. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Dr Peter Stiffell. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Adam.
Welcome back to the podcast. It's your third time. Now,
is it really?
It is. You're a friend of the podcast.
And you're here to talk reward for that.
Possibly. You're here to talk about undoubtedly your favourite subject, Queen Mary I. And what we're talking about today, quite an interesting topic really, the misconceptions around Mary, of which there are many, and I know you're deeply passionate about. Before we get into that, can you just give me a quick introduction to yourself, sort of your background, and where your passion for Mary's story in particular began?
Yeah, so I'm Dr Peter Stiffell. I'm an independent scholar, and obviously I study Mary. I really focus on her imagery, but to understand the imagery, you have to also understand her life and the Tudor court and the century that she lived in. I think I've said this before, but we were always brought up with the stories, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. And it's only when I started sixth form, so that's 17, 18, we were studying the Tudors, and my history teacher said, watch the Tudors, which, Showtime show. She said, it's not going to be accurate, but to understand the characters that you're studying, watch that. So I did, and I just fell in love with Mary, because, we always knew her as the queen, but not her as the person. And Sarah Bolger's performance in it was fantastic. And you really understand why Mary becomes the woman that she does. And it's through that show. And I obviously then got into the history of it, the real history. And I've not looked back. And
would you say, because you're, by your own admission, and I didn't prep you for this, but it's just occurred to me, by your own admission, you are a practicing Catholic. Do you think that added to it?
I think it does. I know some people may disagree with this, but I have that sort of insight to understand what she actually believed in. I know lots, things have changed, but the fundamental things of being a Catholic haven't changed. So, we both believe in the same thing. Obviously, she went to Mass every day. I don't go to Mass every day. I mean, I'd love to go to Mass every day, but, the modern world doesn't allow you to do that. So I'm kind of jealous that she was able to practice her faith in that, the way it should be. So I when I visit, dissolved monasteries, and you do get that sense of, what on earth were we thinking? How does this happen? I can understand, you're brought up in a faith, and then suddenly the whole world just changes around you. And you're at that, impressionable age, 11, 12, 13. And then what's the word? It's like you cement yourself into the only thing that you know and the only thing that you're comfortable with, and it's when you were most happy. So that's your cornerstone for how you then live the rest of your life. Um, so yeah, I think it, to answer your question, I think it does give me a bit of a insight which some historians may not have, because they're either secular or whatever that, Um, but I know some people may disagree with that, but I think it does give me that sort of emotional connection, which, may be a bad thing, but I like it.
And I completely agree with you. I'm not, I'm Church of England, but I totally understand why that would create, for want of a better term, a bit of a bond between your own reading of history and Mary's story. And I totally agree with you that the dissolution of the monasteries, and in particular what happens under the interregnum under Oliver Cromwell, the destruction of many of the great Catholic churches and royal properties and stuff. It's just it is sacrilegious, but it's also devastating for us in the modern age to have lost these ancient treasures.
Yeah, honestly, it's travesty. I mean, I think it's when I went to Italy and Spain, they survived. So you go into these cathedrals, which have been standing for 1,000 years, 800 years, whatever it is. And, they haven't, I mean, you have had a bit of iconoclasm, you did everywhere. But Italy, it's just beautiful because you go in there and the original paintings, the wall paintings are still there. And it's just, I wish we still had it. I mean, I know we've still got a few places in England, especially like Chichester Cathedral, beautiful cathedral, and they've still got some surviving wall paintings. And you just think, goodness me, because, you go into a cathedral or church nowadays and you think, oh, it's all, sorry, Church of England, church, I should say. And, it's all plain walls and you think, oh, it's a bit boring. But no, you have to imagine what it used to be like with wall paintings everywhere. It was just a building of light and colour and wonderful.
Well, that was the case for the Tudor palaces as well. I mean, a lot of people don't realise the remarkable hammer beam roof in the Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace. It's spectacular, but during the Tudor period, that was painted bright gold and blue. I mean, it would have literally been a feast for the eyes, and now it's just that bland brown.
Yes, I never knew that. I knew obviously the Chapel Royal. You've had
it would have looked like the Chapel Royal.
So it would have been very much like that.
Because you had also, bear in mind, so the ceiling was bright gold and blue. The walls were lined with the tapestries, which back then were significantly more vivid than they are now. And the floor was green and white tiles. So it would have been an assault on the senses, colour-wise, but probably very spectacular as well.
And people think Mary's colour coordination wasn't great. I was like, excuse me, look at what she's having to deal with.
Yes, and we'll come to that in more detail, I'm sure. Can you tell me a bit about your PhD and how you decided to focus on your specific topic?
Yeah, it's a really funny story, actually. I always knew I wanted to do Mary. It's trying to think, well, what can I do? We've done the religious side, we've done her as a person. What else is there really to do? I was just laying in bed, about to go to sleep, and for some reason I ended up Googling Mary on like Google Images or something. And I was just going through the images and I suddenly saw a painting which I hadn't seen before. I thought, this is really interesting. And it just opened the doors to a wide variety of imagery. So my PhD was looking at Mary's imagery. So anything with her face on, or her or her symbolism on paintings, coins, medals, manuscripts, legal documents, basically anything with a face on, I'm interested in.
And probably an impossible question to answer, but to that end, what is your favourite image of Queen Mary I?
You ask me this every time, and it's always a different answer. It very much depends on the day and the week. This week, because I recently went to Trinity College, Cambridge, to look at their paintings of Mary. They've got some beautiful paintings, and some of them are contemporary. I would have to say the painting of her in the Master's Lodge is just beautiful. It's not very regal as such. It's more her as a person, and I just love it. So that's contemporary. But there is a beautiful stained glass window of her, though, in the chapel. It's 19th century, but I just love that. I think she's the only woman in the chapel represented in the windows. There may be one or two female saints, but she's the only secular woman, I think, that's represented in the chapel, which I just find really amazing.
Yeah. And I think that's what's great about Mary's portraiture as well. And we've discussed this before, but what I love about Mary's portraiture is I think you do get much more of a sense on how she genuinely looked when compared against certainly her sister's portraiture and to a degree her father's, which are both, there's a lot of Tudor Photoshop happening, particularly with Elizabeth's portraiture. But with Mary's, you're seeing Mary.
Yeah, I mean, Henry and Elizabeth are very much like icons. It's all icon. Whereas Mary's the real, if you look at Antonius Moore's portrait of Mary, you are looking at Mary. It's very much like the Oliver Cromwell thing. I know he didn't say warts and all, but it's that sort of thing. He says, paint me as I am. I don't want any Photoshop or anything like that. Hans Jewith slightly does it, but that's just the English style. Whereas, Antonius Moore comes from that very Netherlandish background. He's worked for Philip, he's worked for Charles, so he understands the Habsburg. And Habsburgs like to know what they look like. It's very realistic. I think it scares some people because of how realistic it is. It looks like a photograph.
Yeah, no, it does. The Antonius Moore, it's an easy answer, but it's my favourite because of that very reason. We're looking at exactly, I believe, what Mary looked like. I think that's how she appeared to her contemporaries. As I said at the start, you're here to talk about the misconceptions around Queen Mary I, but also, let us say, some of your bugbears as a man who as a man who works on Mary I and wants her to be seen and recognised as she should be, as a genuine Tudor monarch. And one of the first things I know that really bugs you is that Mary is invariably referred to, we'll come to the nickname in a bit, but she's invariably referred to simply as Mary Tudor, even in the same sentence as someone saying King Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth I. Mary is Mary Tudor. Why? What is it you think is the reason she's described in this way? I know it really pisses you off.
How do we do this without it being censored? It's pure Protestant propaganda and brainwashing. To anyone, if I ever have to review a piece of work or anything related to Mary, if I see Mary Tudor and it's not in the context which I expect, I will automatically not be happy. So if anyone ever has anything that they want to show me, do not call her Mary Tudor, because we'll start on the wrong foot. And like I said, I've literally was looking at something a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about Mary and Elizabeth and Edward. They said Edward VI, Elizabeth I, and Mary Tudor. If you were talking about Edward VI, and then you said Mary Tudor and Elizabeth Tudor, I would understand because they weren't the monarch. But if you're just referring to them as their regnal name and their regnal number, very be consistent about this. It's pure Protestant propaganda and brainwashing, like I've said. I think it's a way for them to sort of either forget Mary existed and to pretend that she didn't exist and say, she was just that bit of blip on that Protestant history that we have. And it just doesn't give her the dignity that she deserves. You'd have to ask someone who calls her Mary Tudor why they call her Mary Tudor, because I have not the faintest idea. I just really rattles me. It really does.
My modern equivalent is I get really rattled by Kate Middleton.
Yeah. Or it's when they say the Queen's not the Queen, as in
Queen
Camilla.
That one. The Queen's not the Queen. She's the Queen consort. Go away.
She is the Queen consort, but she's the Queen. Queen Elizabeth, when she was married to King George VI, was the Queen. When Queen Mary was married to King George V, the Queen.
She was the Queen, yeah.
Queen Camilla is the Queen. So is Mary is the Queen. It's just...
I think the thing that bugs me about the Princess of Wales as well is because actually she herself hates Kate. She's never been Kate. None of her family or friends call her Kate. So I think that it bugs her, and it's not... She hasn't been Catherine Middleton since 2011. She's the Princess of Wales. So back to Mary. As a whole, she is often viewed as a rather tragic figure, and her youth, particularly her teenage years, her early 20s, is perceived as being quite unhappy, largely down to her father's marriages, in particular that of Anne Boleyn. But how true is this? I mean, what can we see from her, particularly her early 20s? Were there good moments along the way?
Yeah, I mean, it was a tragic upbringing because, going through what she did, of course it would be. She wasn't always unhappy. She wasn't this, miserable person all the time. First 11 years of her life, absolutely fantastic. She was heir to the throne, treated as a princess, had her own household, and spent time with both her parents, which is actually quite rare for royalty. So she was very lucky. It's only from 1527 things begin to shift, and then obviously 1533 is the year, when Anne's, she's top dog, she's in charge, and Mary's treated horrendously. But then, 1536, obviously it starts really bad with Catherine's passing. But when Anne is executed, things start to look up. And she does fit in. She, after reconciling with her father, she does actually have quite a good life. She's treated as the third woman in court. And I mean, when Catherine Howard dies, or executed, I should say, Mary's the second, leading woman in the country. That's why she's in charge of the Christmas celebrations that year. So she does enjoy her place. She does have fun. Obviously, things turn back down when Edward becomes king. But then they come back up, and she finally gets her freedom in 1553.
Yeah. You mentioned there that during Jane Seymour and stuff that she was the third woman. Wouldn't she have been the second? Who was between her and the Queen?
Yes, no, sorry, you're right. So I meant third person in the country.
Oh, right, sorry. I thought you meant third woman.
That was a slip of my tongue. Yes, so she was the second woman. I sort of forgot about the Queen. Sorry, Joe.
Well, easily done.
And the
no shade. One thing about Mary's youth is that she is betrothed on several occasions. All of them come to nothing. Do we know anything about Mary's own preferences and feelings on any of these betrothals?
The trouble is, she's quite young when all these happen. I don't think there's any personal feelings that we have from her. I may be mistaken. I mean, we know, she played the game. She liked the idea of marriage. When ambassadors arrived, she would play the part of the dutiful, wife in waiting. We know, obviously, her mother very much preferred a Spanish match with Charles V over the French. And we know Mary was betrothed to the French a few times, and Catherine wasn't happy about it. But Mary's own opinion, I don't think we really know. We do know, obviously, Mary met Charles when he visited. And despite the age difference, it's that stereotypical teenage crush. And an emotional bond is formed at that meeting, and it lasts till he dies in 1558. She sees him as another father figure. Was it to do love? Was it to do with just familial contact? I don't know. But there was only ever three men in Mary's life, I think. Obviously, her father, Charles, or Philip, obviously, when she does eventually marry Philip, and Cardinal Pole, when he arrives back to England. I think they're the only four men she could really trust. I mean, her father's obviously a different case, but it's her father, so she has to. Oh, and Chapuis as well. But he's not royal, so there has to be that. There has to be that difference, doesn't there? I mean, maybe in another world, they might have been more on friendly terms. I mean, they were friends, obviously, but would it have been any closer? I don't know.
So when Mary came to the throne in 1553, she almost immediately set about restoring the Roman Catholic faith in England, reuniting England with the papacy in Rome. Because of what happens later, and we will come to the burnings because they do need to obviously be discussed, but because of that, there is a perception that Mary was highly intolerant of any religious belief contrary to her own. But in reality, my understanding is that she actually made it clear initially that she wouldn't punish people and that she was willing to take a more middle-of-the-road approach. Is that true? And if so, what was it she was saying?
Yeah, no, it's very true. Firstly, I just want to sort of, again, put my head above the pulpit on this as well. We always say it's restoring the Catholic faith, restoring, but it wasn't restoring as such. It was just returning government policy back to what everyone already believed in. The populace as a whole stuck to the old faith. It was only Edward who really changed things, and even then, it was a minority. It was the nobility and a minority of that who actually were dying. Were Protestant. Despite Edward's reforms, the majority were still Catholic, and you just had to look at when Mary ascends. Look how quickly all the statues and everything else suddenly reappear. People hid them all. They didn't destroy them. Mary was very clear in her faith. And you're right, she didn't force people initially. I mean, I've got her proclamation here. So she has a proclamation on the 18th of August in 1553, and it states, Her Majesty, being presently by the only goodness of God, settle in the just possession of the imperial crown of this realm and other dominions, thereunto belonging, cannot now hide that religion which God and the world knoweth she hath ever professed from her infancy hitherto, which Her Majesty is minded to observe and maintain for herself by God's grace during her time. So doth Her Highness much desire would be glad the same were all her subjects quietly and charitably to embrace. And yet she doth signify unto all Her Majesty's said loving subjects, that of her most gracious disposition and clemency, Her Highness mindeth not to compel any her said subjects thereunto such time as further order by common assent may be taken therein. So she's urging for unity, and she, in another proclamation, she tells people, I want people to stop calling each other papist and heretic. Let's be united. And she knew loads of Protestants. I mean, and she didn't go after them. Anne Seymour was her friend, and her court artist Hans Ewert wasn't Catholic. So she was very much, as long as you keep your private feelings private, but you just follow the state line, I don't think she cared. She'd obviously want to convert you, but as long as you just kept your head down and you just followed the party line, she wouldn't do anything. I mean, because, she was a pragmatist. She understood that some, people who were born 20, 30 years wouldn't know what a Catholic England was. So, it's all about, she's very much like Tony Blair, even though I don't really want to compare the two. It's very much education, education, education.
So, sadly, again, let's discuss this. It would appear that her mindset does change because undoubtedly the most well-known facet of Mary's story is that of Bloody Mary. It's a moniker that basically precedes Mary wherever she goes. Owing to this being a big part of her reputation, we do need to explore it from a few different angles. Firstly, how much of Bloody Mary as a thing should be attributed to John Foxe?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And, I must shout out to my colleague Joanna Strawn here because she really goes into this. The term bloody doesn't appear until the 17th century. And it's all to do with the future James II because, the Protestant England's very much in uproar that they are so threatened by this Catholic who will become the next monarch. So yeah, it's a Stuart thing and a late Stuart thing. We should always be wary of Foxe because obviously his work has a clear narrative and agenda. There's a reason why Elizabeth requested every parish to have a copy. Though Foxe doesn't explicitly call Mary bloody, he didn't exonerate her. So, we can't trust everything that Foxe says. Bearing in mind, the history, the actual book is commendable, and there is one or two things that I do agree with him. I know it's a complete miracle that I'm saying this, but there are one or two things that I do agree with him with, but I think we're going to talk about that later.
What then has changed as far as Mary being willing to tolerate Protestantism in certain situations to the burnings? Because there are, whether we like it or not, there are nearly 300 burnings across her 5-year reign. So, and we'll come to discuss a bit more of that in detail. But I suppose what the question I'm asking is, what changes? What flips Mary from having a quite tolerant view to agreeing to reinstating the heresy laws?
Quiet rebellion. I mean, there's probably a few things, but I think that's a big thing because, she's been tolerant with the whole Jane Dudley thing and Northumberland and everything else. She's been taught, she understands that Jane's just a pawn in her father-in-law's games. She lets Jane's father off the first time, and everyone, she gets attacked for letting so many people off. Saying, Simon Renard, the Spanish ambassador, is absolutely beside himself. Said, "What are you doing? You need to execute these people. They're traitors." I think she says, "I do not want to start my reign with bloodshed. We need peace because this, we've had enough religious war." But her kindness is just thrown back in her face. So when Jane's father then helps Wyatt with the whole rebellion, she says, "No, right, enough's enough. I can't. What is going on? Why are people doing this? Like, everyone loves me, but these nobles are so power hungry, they just can't accept a woman. They can't accept a woman on a throne." That's what it probably is. And they're using religion and other various things as legitimacy for that. I think she's just tired at this point. She's tired of having to fight all her life, and she generally thinks the Protestant faith is it's evil. It is evil, and that's the reason why these bad things are happening. So you need to root out the evil. It's the only way to make things better.
Did you know that she executed? And I find this so fascinating to think. I'm sure she would have. So she executed a grandson of Margaret Pole. Margaret Pole's daughter Ursula had a son, Thomas Stafford, who joined in with Wyatt's rebellion, and Mary has him executed. And I think that's so fascinating because I am sure that when Mary was signing that death warrant, she must surely have felt, I can't believe the grandson of the woman that effectively brought me up and that I loved has come against me. That surely must have crossed her mind.
Yeah. I mean, it must have really upset her, thinking, I know your grandmother was it was her second mother.
Oh, totally.
And the family have been so loyal to her to have this grandson. I mean, I don't know much about Stafford. I don't know what his personality was like. He was clearly an idiot. But why are you doing this?
Yeah.
What is he actually gaining from this? I assume he was Protestant, was he?
Protestant, but he also, because he was a grandson of Margaret Pole, albeit via Ursula, Margaret's daughter, one of the things was, I've got a claim to the throne. But so by that point, so distant that it does, to your point, it borders on idiocy.
It's so distant, and he seems like a bit of an idiot. I mean, it must have torn her, or maybe it did. I mean, I don't know how well she knew him. I mean, she didn't really know him. It's just another name on the street.
Yeah, but I'm sure she was because she was reasonably friendly with Ursula Pole and her husband, and all the accounts suggest that thereafter the relationship does break down. So I'm sure she will have known who it was that she was sentencing to death. Well, agreeing to send to death.
She wasn't his godmother, was she? Because that would have been a bit awkward.
No. And with the burnings, and this was something that was news to me, and I'm fairly certain it was you that told me that actually the thing that we must also remember about the burnings is that in quite a few instances, Mary actually isn't the person who gives the go-ahead. And that one example of that is the Guernsey martyrs, which is quite famous because it was a mother and two daughters. And one of the daughters basically gives birth in the flames. Am I right in? I'm fairly certain it was you that told me that it was the governor of Jersey who just agreed to that, and that Mary wasn't involved.
Yeah, I mean, think about it practically. How long is it going to take for a warrant to go to London, then come back and get it signed? I mean that the whole Guernsey case it's an example of how um one crime can completely blow up into something else. So I'll remind people. So the original case, I can't remember the people's names, so please forgive me. But there's a thief who steals a few like tins of belong to someone else. And she has an accomplice, which is one of the daughters, who later gets burnt. And they find these tins at this woman's house. So obviously, it's all brought to court and everything else. So the original thief, I think she gets her ear chopped off or her hand, something. She gets something chopped off, and she's let go. It then comes to the character witnesses of the other woman, and by this point, her family are sort of implicated because it's the family home. And they all say, "Oh no, she's a really lovely lady, pillar of the community, but she doesn't go to church on Sunday." Well, then the courts think, "Well, hang on a minute, what? What do you mean you don't go to church?" So it goes to church court level, and it just goes up and up and up. And also, yeah, they end up being burnt. And then, yeah, one of the daughters ends up giving birth to what we think is a boy, but the baby's saved. The baby's saved by an unidentified man. But then the mob throw the baby back in. I like to remind people it's not Mary Percy going around burning people. And, I think people should actually look at the actual act itself that she brings back. So the actual act is dated the 16th of January 1555, and it's called an Act for the Reviving of Three Statutes made for the punishment of heresy. So it's three former acts against heresy: the Heresy Act of 1382 under Richard II, the Heresy Act of 1401 under Henry IV, and the Heresy Act of 1414 under Henry V. And these laws had only just been repealed by Mary's father and, well, more her brother. So these laws weren't new. There was nothing new about them. And the act itself, if you actually read it, it says, "ordained and enacted by authority of this present Parliament." It's Parliament who approves it. And when it actually comes to the actual treatment of heretics, we do actually have Mary's personal view of this. And it's in a letter that she wrote to the Privy Council. And I quote, "Touching punishment of heretics, me thinketh it ought to be done without rashness. I would wish none to be burnt without some of the council's presence." She doesn't want a bloodbath. She's not going around burning people. And when it actually comes to the actual documents, look at the actual legality of it. She's just in wherever palace she's in. This death warrant comes through saying, this is the crime, it's heresy. The sentence is death by burning. She's probably given a bit of context about who these people are and what they've actually done. And then she just signs it. She doesn't know these people. All she knows is that these people have broken the law and they were causing a menace in their communities. So she's doing what any right monarch would do, is getting rid of the menace.
And I suppose that's the inherent difficulty, isn't it? That I think we're very much of the same mindset, which is we must not judge people from 500 years ago based on current understanding of codes of behaviour. And Mary is extremely devout. Is it fair to say that she does genuinely, sincerely believe she is doing the right thing? That Protestants, as she saw it, were, for want of a better term, of the devil. She thinks she's doing the right thing. Yeah,
I mean, definitely. I mean, I think we've already gone into this a bit, but you've got to remember, religion was everything to someone in the 16th century. She generally believed that heresy was the work of the devil and it corrupted souls and they would go to hell. There was no ifs, no buts. That is what's going to happen. And, she tried converting people. She sends preachers. She sends her chaplains. They try to help these people when they're being rounded up. And if they can't save them, then the logic was, right, you're going to be sentenced to death by burning because it's a disease and it needs cleansing. And how do you cleanse a disease? It's by fire. You cleanse the community, and you hope that the condemned would then be granted mercy from God. Heresy is a plague, and it has to be stopped before it destroys everyone. And we have to also remember, people always seem to forget, that Edward wanted to bring the exact same thing back. And, Thomas Cranmer began drafting legislation to do this. But obviously, it would be Catholics who were going to be burnt and not Protestants. But people seem to never talk about that.
Yeah, and the next point on that, actually, is also the lack of wider understanding around how Mary and Elizabeth, respectively, actually approached heresy, because they did approach it quite differently. Mm-hmm. To my understanding, Elizabeth conflated heresy with politics. They kind of became one and the same. Mm. Whereas with Mary, it was retained very much as a religious crime. And therefore, by definition, people that died in the flames under Elizabeth, and many did, were traitors rather than heretics. So should that be factored in? I mean, is it effectively, does that mean that we're not viewing the crime, not the crimes, we're not viewing what the sisters did as the same, because the people under their interpretation of what is heresy were condemned in different ways, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, Mary was very much more emotionally passionate about this than Elizabeth was. But it makes sense, because obviously Mary's seen the whole story go through. Elizabeth was brought up with the Protestant faith, and Elizabeth played the political game, which allowed her, no one ever talks about how many Catholics she murdered. And, I think hanging, drawing and quartering is far worse than being burnt, because at least with burning, you'd hope that the smoke would knock you unconscious before the real pain starts. And this was never condemned for this. If Mary had executed heretics as traitors, I don't think we'd be having this conversation.
And that was another thing that I seem to recall you also telling me, is that we also have, I suppose, this perception that many of the people that are burned by Mary are almost all churchmen or people from the church. But actually, there were quite a lot of counsellors and other sort of professional people that were killed. So it wasn't just an attack on people of the Protestant actual religion. It was there were other things going on.
Yeah, the trouble. Yes, the trouble with Mary's policy is she gives back power to the bishops and to the clergy, and we have Edmund Bonner, for instance, who later known as Bloody Bonner, and
Bloody Bonner,
you can see why he does what he does, because he's been locked up, he's been treated as a criminal. He's now having revenge on those who've done it to him. So, he goes and does what he does. And then, some of the clergy may get a bit power hungry, and they will just go into their local community. And you have to remember, they only find out about these cases because someone's dobbed them in. So, it's like the witch trials a century later. It's neighbour against neighbour. If you don't like your neighbour because they've done something wrong, you're going to get questioned. Looping back to the Guernsey case, the only reason the sisters get into trouble is because apparently one of the one who has the child has it without she's not married. So is there that community shame of that person and saying, well, you're going to be punished for having a child out of wedlock? A lot of work needs to be done on that, but obviously, sadly, we don't have the documents to say, why, what was their relationship with the local butcher or whatever it was.
So, thanks to the dark reputation that does surround Mary to a certain degree, and the all too often dour versions of Mary that we see in film and television, thankfully not always, and most recently Romola Gari in Becoming Elizabeth, magnificent. Mary and the word fun don't often feel especially well matched. How inaccurate is this? What can we see of the more light-hearted side of Mary?
Yeah, I mean, it is inaccurate. She's definitely someone who liked fun. She loved music, played games, loved card games. Um, Even though her financiers probably didn't like her playing those. She was a very fun person. I mean, but yeah, she could be very serious as well. But that's how she was brought up. She, like I said, she knew who she was. She knew her place in society. You could be very serious because you've got to deal with these idiotic men surrounding you, trying to give you advice. It's like, no, I know what I'm doing. And she was very dignified. I don't think she was very trusting, but I don't blame her for that after what she went through. And, you can see why she built a wall around her. But yeah, she was very, very fun. And like I said, loved card games, loved gambling, loved to dance. I mean, we don't really think of Mary as a dancer, but she was actually a very good dancer, apparently.
And she was also, I believe, quite a shopaholic. She is that true?
Yeah, she absolutely loved to shop. I mean, if anyone's, I assume your listeners will know of Ab Fab. She's very much an Adina in this scenario. I was looking at her wardrobe accounts actually recently, and like I can't remember the number, but the number of shoes she owns is actually ridiculous. It's in the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands. I mean, it's literally every other page. Oh, I bought new shoes. I bought new shoes. Bought new shoes. Bought. Um, and it comes to such an amount that the Privy Council actually have to ask Philip to tell Mary to stop spending because she's costing the Treasury too much. Um, we don't know if Philip was brave enough to question Mary over her expenditure, but she loved to spend. And when she died, she owed her goldsmiths and artists so much money. I don't think Elizabeth actually paid it all, because she has to be seen as a queen, so she has to have all the latest fashions, the latest jewels. I mean, all the ambassadors mention that she loves her clothes and loves her jewels. Um, and when she was younger, she even gambled her own breakfast over a game of bowls. Um, Typical Mary, she lost the bet, but I'm sure she didn't go hungry.
And Mary also kept a fool, Jane Fool, who's actually depicted, we believe, in the Family of Henry VIII painting. So what do we know of how Mary entertained? Are there accounts of her? What do the accounts say of when she was relaxing? What was she doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of accounts of her dancing, playing music. She did stop playing the lute when she became queen, but I think it's more because she just didn't have the time. Because I think there's a record saying that she'd like to play it more, but she just doesn't have the time. And and if you look at her Christmas gift rolls, well, New Year's gift rolls, I should say, there's loads of musical instruments being presented to her. So she does, she likes to hunt. There's records of her dancing with Philip during their wedding and other celebrations. We know she looked after Jane, and I think it's in 1557 she actually paid someone who'd provided medicine for Jane because she'd hurt her eye. And yeah, I mean, if you look at like the masks and the balls, it's the equivalent of like £500,000 to £1 million on one event that she's paying. And then you have the jousts when Philip's back. Obviously Mary can't joust because she's a woman, but Philip jousts, and the whole court is full of colour. Very much not like the Elizabeth film.
Yes, that the depiction of by Kathy Burke. Nothing wrong with Kathy Burke herself, but the depiction of Mary's court in Elizabeth is frankly atrocious. It's so heavy-handed, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I know what they're doing. I can see why they're doing it, but Mary did not live in a dungeon.
No.
I mean, if you actually think about it, she had
looks
more,
like a cellar.
Mary's court was actually more colourful than Elizabeth's because she's a Catholic queen and her court is a Catholic and her best friend's a Catholic and she's got the imperial networks and they're all Catholic and everyone's happy and merry and getting drunk. It's such a court. I wish I could be there. I really would.
And something else about Mary that is seldom discussed is her really good treatment of her staff. I believe she was extremely kind to the people of her household. So can you share a couple of examples of this? I seem to recall you telling me a story about a man, it may have been a woman, but I think it was a man who hadn't been paid properly, and Mary properly intercedes.
Yeah. So this is another thing I like to talk about, Matt. She's, I mean, I don't know how much I can prove this, but I think she's the first monarch to have the royal walkabout. So what she liked to do, she's very much her father's daughter, likes to dress up in disguise, and she would go and visit poor neighborhoods. Wouldn't tell people who she was. She'd just say she's a lady in waiting to the Queen. And on this one occasion, she's in Croydon, and she's just visited Cardinal Pole. She's staying with him, and she goes with Jane Dormer and I think someone else, and they go round to this collier's house, and this is a guy who provides coal to the palace. Anyway, she shares a meal with him, talks to him and his wife, and in conversation, he brings up that he hadn't been paid for about a month or two, whatever it was. And Mary says, is this true? He says, yes, madam, the Queen's men haven't paid me. And she says, right, come back to the palace gates at 9 o'clock in the morning and payment will be waiting for you. I will talk to the Queen on your behalf. And he says, oh, yeah, thank you very much, madam. I'll be there. Mary goes back to the palace, gets the guy in charge of paying her. I think it's Robert Rochester, who's her comptroller, has a Margaret Thatcher moment on him. Says, why haven't you paid these poor men? They're my subjects. And he acts all innocent, thinking he's, oh, I'm sorry, it must have just been an admin error, or I've forgotten. He says, well, make sure it doesn't happen again, otherwise your job will be at stake. He storms off, and Rochester then asks Jane Dormer, how did she know we hadn't paid him? And Jane says, well, she went and spoke to him. She asked him. And I mean, I would love to have been in the room when he clocks that Mary's gone round, without guards, without any protection. They've just gone into the local village and just spoken to the normal. And she does this all the time. She goes and visits, families who've got lots of children. She gives them food, she gives them money. She asks them, how are you doing? Very much that personal touch without people realizing who they're actually talking to. And she gave apprentices to boys and girls, if she thought that the family was struggling. So she would employ these or help these people get employment or some sort of trade, so they could help the family. And it's just she's the first walkabout, I think.
And that's such a lovely story, and I think it tells us a lot about her as a person, and by extension of that, good works are kind of a prerequisite for certainly queen consorts, but also monarchs. Was Mary committed to charity work, and if so, do we have again much insight into what she did and how she supported the poor, I suppose, in particular?
Yeah, I mean, she was obviously, any good Catholic is very committed to charity works. She refounded the nunnery at Sion. She founded Trinity College Chapel. She gave the universities lots of money, actually, to try to bring back education. And every year during the Holy Week ceremonies, on Maundy Thursday, she'd go and wash the poor woman's feet. It has to be woman because obviously she's a woman. Wash the poor woman's feet, give them clothes, food, money, and every year it'd be the same amount of people as her age. So from 38 to 41, 42. And it's all very personal. You'd have the curing of the Queen's evil, where she'd try to cure you from scrofula. She'd then give you an angel which she'd bless, and she'd tie a ribbon around it and put it over your neck, and she'd say, don't part this coin because I've given you my divine power onto it, and hopefully it'll cure you. Yeah, I think she was a very for the people. She was very much the people's princess.
500 years before that was coined again.
Yes.
So one thing that I know you are voraciously convinced on is that in September 1554, or around then, Mary was definitely pregnant. Now, most people believe that she was never pregnant and that she suffered from pseudocyesis or false pregnancies. What convinces you that this is incorrect, and that certainly in the first instance, probably not the second, but the first instance, that she did truly carry a child? What is it that convinces you of that fact?
Yeah, so, she announces the pregnancy in September. She shows the court her spot on the stomach. She's shown all of the signs. I hate that they always say phantom pregnancies. How do you know? how are you so certain it was a phantom? What? Because she didn't provide this child? Well, she's not going to, is she? I really think she had a miscarriage. I mean, I'm currently looking at the medical science to. I mean, I've already have looked at it, but I'm looking at it again just to back up what I'm saying. I think I know what she suffered from. But your listeners will have to wait for the article for that because I don't think I can really share it. I mean, I know you know personally, but I can't spoil it. But are we saying that everyone was just an idiot? Everyone thought she was pregnant. They all said so. It can't just have been diplomacy because surely secretly they would have said, "Oh, yeah, I don't think she really is." But they all said she was. She showed all of the signs, and she was still having ambassador meetings very late on until mid 1555, and then all of a sudden, closed doors. No one was allowed in for how many weeks it was. That's not normal. Something has happened. And people say, "Oh, well, she can't have had a miscarriage because surely someone would have known about it." But a monarch's very like a queen consort. Yeah, people are going to talk about it because you've got to go and tell the monarch. And you've got those middle people. If the monarch's the woman, and she only has a few women in that room with her, you're telling me that no one's going to say if they really. I mean, she'd only have her most trusted people there, and they're all very loyal to her. They're not going to say anything. There were rumors that she'd given birth to a baby boy. Rumors start from somewhere. Someone must have heard something saying, she's giving birth. She's in labor. She's giving birth to a son. Someone said something somewhere which made London light up with bonfires and celebrations. And even the French ambassador says that she gave birth to a mole. Well, if you actually understand what that term means back then, it means miscarriage. So I'm 100% certain that she suffered a miscarriage the first time. And the condition which I'm looking at, it's actually really, really interesting because human biology does not change. People say, "Oh, you can't diagnose people." Well, no, you can't diagnose them. But if you know what happened and you got the chronology of what happened, and with hindsight, you can see what she later suffers from. It all connects because the condition that she suffered from, you do sadly have a miscarriage, and then sometimes it does lead to cancer later on, and that's what we think the second pregnancy was. It was the cancer, the tumor, and it's on her effigy as well. She's got the swollen belly, and obviously she thought she was pregnant, but everyone else back then they knew she hadn't got much longer to live. But yeah, it's all to do with spring 1555. That's where the clue is. We just need to find something, because like I said, she's having ambassadors a couple of weeks before, if not a few days before. Absolutely fine, nothing wrong with it. And then suddenly, no one's allowed in. There's something not right about that.
Why do you think it's come down the centuries that Mary was just mistaken? I mean, is much of it owing to Elizabethan propagandists, or is it, I suppose you could argue as well, not Mary's own fault, but if they didn't put out a clear message that she definitely miscarried, I suppose there's always that room for error. What do you think is going on?
Yeah, so the reason I don't think she announced that she had a miscarriage was because obviously everyone was very superstitious back then. If you have a miscarriage, you're done. It's over for you.
Certainly by her age as well.
Well, exactly. And she knew what happened to her mother and her stepmothers. What happens when you have a miscarriage? It doesn't end well for you. Obviously, she's the monarch, so it's not like she's going to be chopping her own head off. But she knows how quickly you lose your power if you've done that. And the whole superstition about witchcraft and everything else around that time. She obviously thought it was safer. I mean, nothing's mentioned. She goes to Hampton Court, has the confinement, and then at the August, she just leaves Hampton Court. Not a word. So they don't even say it was a mistake or anything. It's just tries to bury it. And it's quite interesting that that's the same time when the heresy laws are really ramping up. It's all in the same period. So she obviously thinks, I've lost the baby because of this. And in terms of the whole phantom pregnancy thing, I mean, a lot of people use source as the source. Sorry, use Fox as the source. Um, but without spoiling anything, you should really actually read what he actually writes. Because a lot of people look at the first half of the sentence he writes and say, he says phantom, right, so it's a phantom pregnancy. Well, actually read the rest of that sentence and it may give you a clue.
Okay. Well, well,
That's your homework.
yeah, it definitely is. Mary is, I suppose, all too often, a bit like her brother, viewed as a caretaker monarch, someone who achieved little, despite the fact that she is the first true Queen Regnant in English history. What things did Mary establish that fundamentally changed the landscape of queenship in the regnal sense, and by extension of that, what I suppose Elizabeth inherited, appropriated, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, the most significant thing is that she becomes the first Queen Regnant in England. Without her, who knows when we would have had our first, would we have had Elizabeth? Would we have had Victoria? Would we have had Elizabeth II? No, when would we have had our first female monarch? And how would that have worked? Yeah, when they say caretaker monarch, it's complete rubbish. Um, you know, she didn't know she only had 5 years. She thought she had a lot longer. No, her first act is to reform the coinage and to begin stabilising it, because obviously, after the debasement policies of her father and brother, England's a laughingstock. There's no financial benefit to being in England. She starts to change that, and it nearly there when she dies. It's obviously Elizabeth then takes the credit for it because she finishes the job and says, "Oh, look at me! No, I've done all of this." Well, no, hang on, your sisters are to this. Um, Another thing is that with Philip's help, they rebuilt the navy. Because the navy was in complete dire stock. Um, and they helped rebuild it. And it's actually quite ironic that the navy that Philip helps build later defeats him in the Armada. So, and it's probably the same ships. Well, it is the same ships. So, you must have thought, hang on a minute, what? These are my own ships firing at me. Um, yeah, so our navy, um, coinage, being a queen, are her most significant achievements, I think.
Doesn't she also change the language and sort of establish that she absolutely rules just as much as a king?
Yes, I mean, the act of well, it's one of her first acts. Well, I think it's the first act. Regnal power, whatever it's called. She says she is a king. She's a female king. She has much, because I think there's a story that Gardner says, technically all of these, Magna Carta and all these other laws to limit a monarch's power only applies to men. You could do what you liked. And she says, no, will follow precedent. I will be exactly like my father was. I am a female king. So anything that applies to kings applies to me. I'm not going to be a dictator or autocrat, because a lot of people think kings and queens have all this power. They do have power, but you know I know we say constitutional monarchy, from the 17th century onwards, but there was a sort of constitutional monarchy-ish back then. They couldn't just do what they liked. They had to run through Parliament. Obviously, Parliament would just agree to it. Then well, no, they didn't actually. Not under Mary. There was a lot of back to and fro with Parliament and her. She, especially with the heresy laws and the church lands, she wanted to return them. Parliament were quite ferocious and trying. No, we're not doing that. And it does take a while for both sides to compromise.
Yeah, an absolute monarchy is not a dictatorship.
Exactly.
I think is the thing, and her reign is often viewed as a bit of a disaster. But would you argue that well, firstly, I know you would argue that her reign was far from a disaster, but would you also say that she also had really bad luck? I mean, there is the crop failures, for example, and it was a very wet few years when she was queen, so the crop failures, they're hardly her fault. I mean, so really, did she have quite a lot of bad luck, things that were way beyond her control?
Yeah, she just had bad luck and no time. Like I said, we can't blame her for the crop failures and the pestilence. That's not her doing, even though the Protestants would say it was. If she'd lived another 10 years, she would have overcome these disasters and taken credit for the policies which I've already mentioned. And we also have to remember she was Queen of Spain and the overseas territories. She achieved everything her father and siblings never did. They never ruled over an empire. She did, even though it was, through Philip, but they were a joint team. They were both king and queen. If given time, the Spanish alliance would have benefited England more. You would have got the gold and silver from the New World. It would have helped England along. They would have been part of this whole trading network. Yes, you just needed more time.
More time and some better luck. So finally then, what one thing would you love most for people to stop believing about Mary?
I'm going to say two because they're both linked.
Go for
I'm
it.
allowed to. Stop using the B word and stop calling her Mary Tudor because I'm sick to death of it.
There we go.
I honestly, I mean, like I said, last week someone said it, and I said, and as soon as they say that, I say, "Oh, you mean Mary the First?" I always do that, because it's ridiculous. I mean, you've got loads of books which say it. I think one of the monarchy rulers used to say it. It's just, I mean, and when I do read something that says Mary First, I think, oh, I wasn't expecting that. I'm just, I've only ever called her Mary Tudor when I'm talking about the whole two bodies of the crown. You've got the body politic and the body spiritual. That's the only time I ever, I called her Mary Tudor and Maria Regina. They're two separate beings, but in one being. That's the only time I use that word. Because she wasn't called a Tudor. They didn't call themselves Tudors. They didn't want anything to do with that.
Yeah, I do, and I do get just a slight sense with that it is almost, there is an aspect, there's an element of maybe even subconsciously, I don't think people are necessarily doing it consciously, but minimising her importance by referring to her as Mary Tudor rather than Queen Mary the First. It does strike me as a slightly, it's a way of making her less significant.
Yeah, definitely. It's to try to erase her because she's seen as that blip in that Protestant progression. I mean, it is changing. Academia's very much changed its tune, I think. It's just trying to get the public, or just if you keep saying Mary the First, people will eventually clock on. I know a lot of tour companies use Mary Tudor, not naming names, and a lot of no, I know it's not you. It's more the places you visit, mate. The places you visit, some use it, and then you get the glared eyes from me. But yeah, no, it's just going to take time. Hopefully in 10, 20 years, we won't ever have to hear of Mary Tudor again. It'll just be Mary the First.
As it should be. Well, thank you very much for coming back onto the podcast. This has been really interesting. And I've been wanting to do a Mary Misconception episode for a while, and you were the obvious candidate. So thank you very much again. So you mentioned there that you're working on something around Mary's pregnancy?
Yes, so I am currently working on an article, just in the editing bits at the minute. I don't know when it's going to be released or who it's going to be released by, but it's definitely in the works. And there's a lot of science in this article because I wanted to get into the science of it. I know historians shouldn't really get into the meddle with the science, but I thought it was actually, no, it's important for this sort of thing because this isn't just, a historical fact. This is actually something very personal to this individual, who we've always said it was a phantom pregnancy. But I think that's quite insulting, not only to her but to everyone else.
It's quite presumptuous.
Exactly. We will never know what happened in that period. We will never know. So why should we always just assume it's a phantom pregnancy when it may not have been? I just want to sort of open the conversation, saying, it may well have been a phantom pregnancy. Fair enough, but it may not have been. So let's actually think, oh, it may not have been, and that's why this then happens, because she's just suffered from quite a traumatic ordeal.
Well, thank you very much again, and I am sure you'll be back on the podcast at some point in the future, probably to talk about your findings as and when they're released.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I look forward to it.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Dr Peter Stiffell for coming back onto the podcast to discuss the many misconceptions of Queen Mary I with me. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes or guests, feel free to drop me a message either on Instagram, or if you're a subscriber to the podcast, you can drop me a message on Patreon. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and chat to you next week.